Welcome. Hi, I'm Will Hearst, and my guest today is Paul Saffo, who is an old friend and who has made a career of being a brilliant forecaster of trends and events and across a very wide swath of both technology and culture and politics. And Paul has a firm in Silicon Valley where he rents his genius to other people, but he's also a teacher at Stanford, and he's also a fabulous person to spend some time with. Please join me in welcoming Paul Saffo.
Great to be here, Will, and I will pay you for that introduction after the camera's off.
It's always intrigued me that a person could be and make a business out of being a futurist. So how does that work?
The truth is, I haven't done the futurist thing for a couple of years.
I know, but you're still to some
so
degree.
I'll answer. So usually when someone wants to look into the future, they're in an industry that's either poised for fundamental change or has just gone through a fundamental change, and they're going, what the heck is going on? So it's that moment in time when people realize that the uncertainty is a whole lot greater than they realized. Mm-hmm. And so what I do and when I come in is I help them understand uncertainty. I don't predict,
Yeah, I know you. I've heard you say that, but say more if you can about
Yogi
the difference between
Yogi Berra put it right when he said prediction's really difficult, especially when it's about the future. Prediction is logically impossible as long as you believe we're in a world where our actions in the present affect outcomes in the future. So the way I think about looking into the future is that you're looking at into a cone of uncertainty. You're basically mapping a cone of uncertainty and say, how broad is the cone? What's inside it? What are the signposts to look for that a particular future is coming to pass? And in that sense, the trick is if you draw that cone too narrowly, you're going to miss things. You're going to be surprised. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's generally not a good thing.
Right.
If you draw it too broadly, you're going to end up wasting your time.
Doesn't mean much.
Looking at stuff. It's boiling the ocean to get a cup of salt.
Yeah.
So the art is to get it just right and then figure out the granularity you need to look out.
And this is I should ask you, how does your new firm differ
our new
from
firm,
the traditional Institute of the Future?
Yeah, so I left the think tank world in 2006, and right after the market crashed, I and three others co-founded our current company, Discern Analytics, that's doing long-range financial analytics, big data, algos for Wall Street.
Really?
Yeah, and it's a mixture. Our model is we take top analysts, we turn them into data curators, we look for stranded data, and we connect that together. And what we found is that, in this whole big data algo world,
right,
that's all essential but not sufficient. You still need human judgment. And the hard part for government is organizational. You can really summarize the modern condition with all the networks in the web is that governments are stovepipes, they're hierarchies.
Yes.
And their competition are networks. Al-Qaeda's a network, terrorists are networks, the public is a network.
Right.
And so you have a hierarchy trying to serve a network and also in competition with other networks.
Well, that's an interesting idea, that these sort of hierarchically organized institutions are colliding with non-hierarchical institutions.
Our greatest national security threat today, in fact, I think it's the greatest civilizational threat, is not bad guys with bowling ball bombs and terrorists. It's networked crime.
Since we've come so close to this topic, let me at least draw you out on because the Edward Snowden phenomenon. What's your sense? How do you parse that as in any way that you want to grab the elephant?
Well, my top level
grab
reaction.
The trunk or the tail or the ear.
First of all, what was the government thinking? We learned in the age of photocopiers that there's no such thing as a permanent secret.
Right.
So what were they possibly thinking this wouldn't get out? Beyond that, my initial reaction was a little bit like Henry Kissinger's quip in the first few days of the Arab-Israeli 7-Day War, someone said, Dr. Kissinger, who would you like to see win? And he paused and he said, it would be nice if both sides lost.
It's a pity they both can't lose.
Yeah, but, you know, it's at moments you look at the NSA and you think, you know, the NSA has to be a mole for Al-Qaeda. That's the only explanation here, because the economic damage that their mass collection of information caused. You know, a lawyer would say, this is strict liability. You collected a dangerous thing that escaped. This is no different than putting a dam on your property and impounding water, and the dam fails and it floods out your neighbor down the river, and say, well, hey, it's just water. It's like, no, you're strictly liable.
Right. I never heard that metaphor. That's really interesting.
The mistake was collecting the information to begin with. And, you know, national security cost of that, the economic damage to the United States, you know, the very real loss of value of American technology companies who can't get customers abroad, and now the pressure to create separate intranets and the like. Yeah, sensors have come on, and that was back in '95. That was a long time ago.
So that's about right, 20 years.
The more important part of the observation is not the sensor part, it's the texture of change, because it points to what's after sensors. And my argument was that the 80s were shaped, everybody talked about personal computers in the 1980s, but really what the 80s were about were cheap processors.
Yes,
the advent of cheap processors in the late 70s gave us a processing revolution, and PCs were the poster child.
Right.
Then in the late 80s, along comes the laser diode. And that set us up for a communications access revolution.
Right, for a bandwidth explosion.
Bandwidth. So this is fiber optics, it's, remember, CD-ROMs.
Yep.
And the shift was we went from the PC symbolized processing decade of the microprocessor, and in about 1987 I said the next decade is not about processing, it's going to be about access. I don't know what it looks like, but the machines that will matter most will not be defined by what they process for us, but by what they connect us to.
Yeah, yeah.
And then in the early 90s when MEMS arrived, I went, oh, of course the next thing, you know, we created our machines, we connected them together, they're living in cyberspace with no sense of the physical world.
Right.
The obvious next step is we're going to put eyes, ears, and sensory organs on them and ask them to observe the world on our behalf, and we're there. Each new abundance creates an adjacent scarcity. So abundance in data creates a scarcity in algorithms. Faster algorithms creates a scarcity in processing. So you're just chasing that circle. But it also says, you know, are we going to work this out before we hit the next technology? And of course we won't. And, you know, the next thing on the horizon is already beginning to be here, and that's effectors. Because if you observe the world, then you want to affect the world. And, you know, the darkest example of this is going to be, you know, killer drones.
Which are the first sign of effectors.
Right. So they're here now, and we already have, you know.
See, you can't help yourself, Paul. You're building these models. And
well, but what's scary is
sense of
we're going to rush into the effector part without sorting out the algorithm part. So, you know, the question is, what year is going to be the first person killed by a robotic drone that acted on its own authority? Now, we had people killed by accident. There was a robotic anti-aircraft drone system. It was a ground-based system in South Africa back in the 90s, and there are all the poobahs there to watch the demo, and the thing goes nuts. It goes, takes out all the VIPs.
Oh my goodness.
You know, and the first person killed by a drone was way back in 2002. But, you know, there are two kinds of indicators. The things I look and go, that's weird, I better pay attention to it. The other one is, okay, what's the one I'm looking for that means something's coming to pass? So the first person killed by autonomous robot without the robot asking a human for permission first, that will be a watershed, and I think it's coming fast. So you look at a company like Google, you know, Microsoft was a good old-fashioned monopoly. Bill Gates would, you know, find the enemy, stare him down, and kill him. Google and so that it's kind of an off-the-wall example. That's like a New York driver, in traffic. They stare you down and intimidate you. Boston drivers intimidate you by pretending you're not on the road. What Google does is
Hunter Thompson used to say, make them think you're crazy.
Make them think, exactly. So Google's strategy, if Microsoft played chess, Google plays Go. Mm-hmm. And they succeed by creating profit deserts. They'll take somebody else's thing they're trying to sell for money and turn it into an externality for the user that gives data to Google.
Yeah.
Google Maps killed the mapping business. Google Search killed the for-profit online services.
Yeah.
And so in a way, Google is like, a mycelial layer of mushrooms, a fairy ring of mushrooms as it, spreads outwards and nothing's growing in the middle because it took all of the nutrients.
But it's very clever, don't you think? I mean, if I can bond an audience to me, which may or may not be an audience that advertisers are interested in, but I can extract what you're calling, I think, an externality. I can extract data, I can extract behavioral signals from you, and then I can monetize those somewhere in the back room. That's a very clever business model.
It's a clever model, and
it's certainly not what traditional media companies do.
Well, here's the social hazard of that. For you and me as consumers, are we unwittingly paying a whole lot more than we think?
Yeah, I've never seen that analyzed. I mean, I haven't really absorbed your idea entirely, but I think you're on to something, that there is a transaction, there is a price. You are subscribing.
Well, I'll tell you.
But you're paying in a kind of weird Bitcoin of your behavioral memes.
Well, but paying Bitcoin would be nice because you keep some anonymity. I don't do anything illicit, but yes. I still carry cash. And I don't join...
Cash is useful for anonymous transactions.
And I don't have a frequent shopper card at the local market. I just want my anonymity. I don't want, there's a value
That's
to keeping some
That's a price you're not willing to pay.
Yeah.
To just, What do you think of self-driving cars?
I did an economist debate that...
Oh, bravo.
This is before 2020, they're on the highway. And by the way, when we do have robotic cars, we're not going to buy them.
Would lease them?
No, you would subscribe to them.
Subscribe to them.
It doesn't make sense to have this vehicle. I mean, some people will.
I like the idea of stepping out and telling the car, go park yourself.
But it's happening fast enough that, as a Californian where, it was our birthright at 15 and a half to get our learner's permit, especially as guys.
Well, I remember going...
But here's, stick with me. This is what's really critical is, what is the rite du passage for teenage boys in California when the cars drive themselves? We're going to have to take an old Air Force base in the Mojave and get some 1950s cars out there and just, sort of like in Papua New Guinea when they send the boys out into the wilderness, that this will be how we take our teenagers and give them the rite du passage, is they have to drive an old-fashioned car. To pick where the curve changes direction, you have to trace back to the start. Well, the first sort of semi-automatic things were photocell bright light controls in the 1950s in high-end cars, and we're getting better and better with automatic braking and stuff. And you start plotting things along a line, and it's like listening to the Doppler whistle of an approaching train, that the frequency is going up, frequency of these things is happening. You can see the robotic stuff happening in other spaces, and you say, it's got to, there's an inflection point around the corner.
Yeah, there's an inflection point. There was an enormous expansion of capability in aviation, from not being able to fly to autopilots over the
What was that
Atlantic.
Moment with Glenn Curtis?
I mean, from the Wright brothers to Juan Trippe was a huge jump.
Absolutely. And in those points where, the first autopilots, the invention of control surfaces where you're no longer wing warping.
Right.
And that's one to watch for in aviation. What year is the last plane made that has definable control surfaces? That it's now got sensors and effectors in such density that the wing is a shapeshifter and you don't have crazy flaps going up and down.
Well, one of the reasons changing wing shapes is difficult is because it adds a lot of complexity, and you want simplicity as your friend in aviation.
Algorithms, processors.
Cheaper and cheaper.
I'm not going to fly a plane running Microsoft Windows, but eventually we'll get it right.
Very good.